Hey guys, I'm Declan, and with Ethical Fashion Today, we're going to be looking at the new Oxfam Australia report called Made in Poverty, the True Price of Fashion. So it's based from like perspective of Australian brands. I'm going to start with just a little introduction of what Oxfam considers itself. So it says, at Oxfam, we believe all lives are equal and no one should live in poverty. We join forces with people who share this belief to empower communities to build better lives for themselves, not only to save lives in times of crisis, but also to develop lasting solutions. So just going to give a bit of background of the Australian fashion industry. The Australian fashion industry is worth almost 23.5 billion. That was in 2018. It says here that the Australian fashion industry is getting bigger. Since 2015, returns to the shareholders of the 5 major clothing companies in Australia have increased by 81% per year on average, which is a huge increase. So for this report, they have interviewed more than 470 workers across Bangladesh and Vietnam, and also in more than 130 interviews with factory owners, managers, union leaders and focus groups to try to get a clear picture of the way the fashion industry works in Australian garment supply chain. So out of that's quite a big pool of 470 workers, the forward just talks about one family as like an example. It's quite interesting. So I'm just going to read most of this. And given they haven't got the real names, obviously. It says so this couple, husband and wife, they have 3 children, and they live in a cramped single room measuring less than 9 square meters, and 2 of the girls must sleep on the floor because they don't have beds. The wife works in a factory in Bangladesh that supplies clothing to Australian household name department store Big W. Despite working in the industry for 6 years, she takes home as little as $128 Australian dollars a month, even when she works overtime. The overtime can run up to 3 a.m. at least once a week for the busy shipment times. Her average rate of pay is 51 cents per hour. With this little amount of pay, the family cannot afford for any of their daughters aged 5, 12 and 14 to attend school. Recently, the lady and her husband were forced to make a painful decision to ensure that the family could meet their needs, and they had to send their teenage daughter to follow the path of her mother and work in the garment factory industry. This report by Oxfam reveals the harsh and heartbreaking reality that this family is not alone. Based on hundreds of interviews with workers in Bangladesh and Vietnam, this research lays bare the fact that the widespread payment of pittance wages in the garment sector is trapping workers and their families in a cycle of poverty. So then it just goes into a lot of the research that they've done. It's very interesting and worrying at the same time. So 9 out of 10 workers that were interviewed in Bangladesh cannot afford food for themselves and their families, forcing them regularly to skip meals and eat inadequately or go into debt to eat. Most workers cannot afford medical treatment when they get sick or injured. 76% of workers interviewed in Bangladesh supplying to major brands have no running water inside their home. And also in Bangladesh, 1 in 3 workers interviewed are separated from their children. About 80% of those cases is due to lack of adequate income. So Oxfam with this report is calling for companies to take real action to implement living wages in their supply chains, allowing the workers making our clothes a chance at decent lives. This starts with a credible commitment to living wages and a time frame for implementing key milestones along the way. Another Oxfam report states that the cost of the average piece of clothing sold in Australia would increase by just 1% to ensure that workers in Australian garment supply chain earned a living wage. which seems like it's such a simple solution that I don't think the consumer would even notice or mind. So it's got its description of the living wage. It says the living wage is a simple concept. It is the idea that the lowest wage paid to a full-time worker needs to cover the essential basics: enough nutritious food, decent housing, healthcare, clothing, transportation, utilities, childcare, education, and other essential needs, as well as some savings for the future and unexpected events. The living wage is not a luxury, it is a minimum that all working people should be paid. If they are expected to escape poverty, a living wage should be earned in a standard work week, no more than 48 hours, by a worker, and be sufficient to afford a decent standard of living for the worker and his or her family. At the moment though, 9 out of 10 felt like their income is not sufficient or partially sufficient to meet their needs. 100% of garment workers earn below the living wage compared against the Asia Floor Wage and the Global Living Wage Coalition, which is standards basically to measure the living wage. Even when you include overtime income, extra work hours income, still 90% of workers in Bangladesh earn below the living wage. It's also common that's based on a salary, so it's also common that management will incorrectly calculate wages and deduct salary for not meeting production targets, so they get paid even less than what they're than the very little that they're already supposed to be receiving. 91% of garment workers cannot afford food for themselves or their family. Just talking about the way that the living conditions of these people, the average number of workers living in one room is 3. So there's normally 3 people living in one room, and the average room size is around 10 square meters. And this obviously is based in Australia, so it compares it to the average home size in Australia, which is nearly 200 square meters. It's just a big difference of living. All of the people interviewed, 0% of the 0 people, not one person, wanted their children to work in the garment industry. Which just shows how unpleasant it is. So in the next section it talks about the role of brands in this system, exploiting system. And it says there's no doubt that big brands are propping up this system of poverty wages and exploitation in the garment industry in order to make profit. But it's not just by making money from this exploitation that demonstrates how brands are a part of the problem. The practice of big brands actively keeping low wages and force tough choices onto workers and factory management. Forcing the local market of the factories and workers are losing, but the buyers are ultimately still gaining with profit margins and stuff. It's got a little map here showing a bit of the system, so it's different places, because on average a garment goes through about 5 countries before it gets to market. So it says here that you've got the growing stage of the cotton, the making of the plastic, the synthetic fibres, then the spinning stage where it turns into a fabric basically, and then the cutting, sewing, trimming stage, and then the making of that into a t-shirt, and embroidering, printing and stuff like that, and then the warehouse stage. I think there's a different certificates tend to only spot different stages, not many certificates that spot the whole stage. Another way that brands put pressure on to these manufacturers is, which is quite a common practice apparently, according to this report, is that they reduce the delivery time. So they say that they want it a lot sooner, and then if they can't meet that time, then there's fines and they receive less money for. That's another way of the brands paying even less money for the products. Another problem that they've found is that many buyers, which I actually didn't know this, but many buyers are not committed to building stable relationships with factories over time. Buyers usually don't go for long-term commitments, so they'll make a commitment of maybe 6 months to a year, and then the factory won't know whether it's got long-term, whether it's going to work with that brand again or not. So obviously that creates a lot of pressure and a lot of lack of responsibility. So it's got coming up with the report's got suggesting some of the, as usual, like solutions or responsibility to be taken. It says Australian brands make big money and they must act to change the way the system works. They can help lift women out of poverty while still producing affordable, good quality products. So it's got some recommendations. It says basically, and it says that these are the basics. Should be transparent. Should publicly disclose their factory list and update it regularly. Should have a fair deal with human rights abuses. Support factories to establish effective grievance mechanisms. Allow workers to organise. Adopt a positive and proactive freedom and association policy. Consult with unions and workers' representatives, ensuring that workers are able to have a representative say in their working conditions in all factories and are a meaningful part of all wage negotiations. Empower women workers, adopt a positive and proactive gender policy and gender-sensitive targets. So I think that's just expecting that as like a minimum. And then it says that what they really should be working on is making a credible commitment to living wages. Publicly commit to respecting the right to a living wage and working towards the implementation of living wages in the company's supply chain. And it points out that this should clearly indicate the commitment to stay in a sourcing country when wages increase, so not just to leave and go to another factory. So that should be in the policy, which I think is great, because a lot of people's concern is that if factories can't increase the wages or have a more sustainable system, because brands will just leave and go to somewhere else. Actively engage, advocate and support governments in increasing minimum wages. And keeping that, it says also they want them to conduct living wage pilots as appropriate to the supply chain and just adjust the living wage roadmap based on the lessons they've learned, in case, like, obviously over time things will change. So that's what it's expecting from brands, which I think is will be great for brands to jump on. It's expecting for the government, Australian government, because it's based around Australian brands, this particular thing, but obviously this system is a worldwide problem, really. Wants it to introduce legislation that would require large companies to report on the way they deal with human rights, and that the government should also invest in educating large companies about their human rights responsibilities and the risk they might be infringing on people's rights. So basically to have good human rights laws and enforce them, basically. So that's basically the most of the report. It's got a list of some of the leading brands and companies operating in Australia that are sourcing from these countries, including likes of Zara, H&M, like big ones, Kmart, Target, Big W. It's talked about a bit in this report. I also got quite a bit of information about a company called Cotton On, which I've never heard of. It's obviously quite big in Australia. It seems to be growing very fast. Uniqlo, yeah, a lot of big brands, international brands, really. So yeah, I think it's a great report. A lot of information, and sometimes you wonder like whether this is actually making a difference. But what's quite interesting with this one is there's another article on Oxfam that points out that Kmart and Target, which was on the list of big brands, have taken big steps towards living wages off the back of this. So it's congratulating them as two major Australian brands strengthened their commitment to a living wage by improving how they source their clothes from countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, complete with clear milestones and timelines. That's just obviously proves that it's working, and that brands really are listening to some of these bigger reports and stuff, and obviously it's making it public as well. So this is obviously great, and hopefully more brands will follow along, and hopefully with some of these brands that have with these brands Kmart and Target, which are obviously international brands, maybe this will help in other countries as well that they're trading from. Hopefully there's more reports from other countries as well to help keep pushing this ethical fashion forward. So that's another positive day for ethical fashion. Thanks for watching or listening. This has been Ethical Fashion Today. See you tomorrow.